Okay, welcome everyone here over here in Amsterdam, and a special welcome to Graham Harman over there in the States. What time is it there?
7 in the morning.
Whoa, okay. Really nice that you're here with us. My name is Frank Meester. I'm a Dutch philosopher and writer, and I'm really thrilled to have the opportunity to do this interview with one of the most interesting philosophers of our time. We're going to discuss his book, Object-Oriented Ontology, a new theory of everything. And after this, you have the opportunity to ask questions. So if you have a question, keep it in mind, and then know that later there will be time to get your answer. Object-Oriented Ontology is not just the name of this book. It's also the name of a philosophical movement, you could say. And Graham Harman serves as one of the central figures of this movement, if not the very founder of it. It has 3 O's, so it's also called triple O. And it may sound quite obscure, maybe you think it's really complex, but on the other hand, the title is quite clear and accurate. It's an ontology, which you can say, it's a philosophy which is oriented towards objects. Objects are the most important things in the world, in the universe. That's the whole theory, you could say, in a few words, in 3 words, in fact. And through this movement, Graham Harman seeks to challenge 2 philosophical standpoints, you could say. On the one hand, there is people like Daniel Dennett, who thinks in the line of the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus of Wittgenstein, and he thinks that we could describe reality, and we could do this by using clear language, unambiguous language, literal propositions, and in this way we could describe reality. On the other hand, you have philosophers like the most, what we could call post-modern philosophers, who says, no, it's impossible to do an absolute claim about reality, so we better not talk about reality and just focus on language only and on culture only. Now, Harman is trying to find a way to be realistic on the one hand and not be naive and think that we could just describe reality as such in a simple way. Another thing is that he doesn't want to discriminate between objects. Human objects are not the most important objects in the world. There are many, many objects, and they're all very important. I think this is a very short introduction to your philosophy. I hope you do agree with the introduction, but we will talk about this later. First, I want to go to a very, very important thing right now. Next week there are the elections in your country, and I don't know how this audience is if these people are in favor of Trump or of Harris, but people start to laugh. I think most people are, just like me, in favor of Harris, but not really because of Harris, more because of Trump. That's the problem. And the question is how Trump is telling lie after lie, and with your theory in mind, how can we defeat Trump and Trumpism?
I'm not sure how to defeat Trumpism. In fact, I'm terrified that apparently half of our country is willing to overlook a litany of offenses with the storming of the Capitol 4 years ago on January 6th, perhaps the worst of them. I find it incomprehensible that half of the people still support him, and I don't think this is a moment to nitpick liberal democracy. We need to say what we have at the moment, and then we can self-critique about that.
Yeah.
But the first necessity, our first duty, is to defeat this horrible person whose impact will be felt around the world, of course, and in Europe very much so, not just in the United States.
Yeah, but how? Maybe because we can use your theory to defeat him. Because in the introduction you say we don't have to do like fact-checking. This is not really this important. You make this difference you make between, on the one hand, truth, and on the other hand, knowledge, for example, is important to understand how we could deal with Trump. But maybe then it's better to focus first on the object and your theory, and then come back to Trump later. No, let's do it like this. Okay, so. We talked about objects already, and when you talk about an object, you think like this is an object, or maybe I'm an object. But for example, this happening, this interview, is this also an object?
Yes, there's really no limit on what can be considered an object. An object simply needs to have an autonomous character in the sense that it's not reducible either to the parts it's made of or to the effects it has on other things. So there's something about an object that is self-contained and that we can learn about so that it's never equivalent to any particular form of knowledge we have about it. Knowledge is always going to be a poor summary of the thing itself.
So if, say, this is an object, we are an object together, when does this object end to be the same object? For example, if I take the audience away, is it still the same object?
Perhaps not. It's not always easy to answer those sorts of questions in advance. You know, just as in phenomenology, they try to reach an intuition of essence by eidetic variation and by getting rid of the accidental properties of a thing. Something similar can be done in the case of object-oriented ontology. Sometimes it's not clear exactly what parts of an object are essential to it or not. And so I wrote an article once, for example, called The Shipwreck of Theseus, because in this famous paradox of the ship of Theseus, where you have the original ship that's being replaced one piece of wood at a time, and then someone is taking the old pieces of wood and reassembling them into a new ship, which of those two is actually the real ship?
Yeah.
The one with the original wood or the one that was the original ship that was rebuilt board by board? And the answer I came up with is that neither of those is the real ship. Both of those options assume that to keep a thing the same, you need to preserve some sort of detail. And you're simply disagreeing over whether it's the physical wood or whether it's the formal configuration of the wood. I raised the possibility that perhaps the shipwrecked version of the ship of Theseus is the real one, that to see a thing in ruins...
So they made three objects. There's the original ship, which was an object, and there are the two new ships, which are new objects.
Yes, and there have been some philosophers who have taken that path. It seems to me that what I want to do is strip detail away to get to the thing. And this is a disagreement I often have with my late friend Bruno Latour, who never wanted to see any part of the object as some sort of nucleus that defined its essential properties. For him, a thing is whatever it does to other things. A thing is an actor is its actions. Whereas for me, many of the actions in which a thing is involved or the contextual relations in which a thing is involved are inessential. They can be stripped away and the thing is still the same thing. And we can't always know in advance, or we can never know in advance, rather, what those important properties of a thing are. There are certain mental exercises needed. I would go so far as to say that the style of a thing is what makes it real. So when I play with ChatGPT, which I do sometimes, one of the things I like to do is to have ChatGPT redo content in a different style. For example, my favorite moment of playing with ChatGPT was when I asked it to rewrite the opening scene of King Lear as a Samuel Beckett play. And the result was absolutely wonderful. No human could have done it better, rewriting the opening scene, but as a Beckett play rather than a Shakespeare play. And the reason that's possible and interesting is because things are styles more than they are content. And so you strip a thing away from its content, you've still got something there that's the thing.
Yeah. So the style is really important. So objects, everything can be an object, and we don't know in advance if what exactly this object of this event will be. We can say it afterwards, maybe. And if we change the object, maybe we make a new object. It depends. Sometimes it depends a little bit on what happens. And then, sorry?
Yes, I'd actually written a book about your famous national company, the Dutch East India Company, where I talked about how it maintained its identity in its early years, despite making symbiotic attachments with a small number of other objects, half a dozen or so. And so there's a sense in which the book is what it is from the moment of its declaration. But what really makes the company what it is are certain irreversible events that happen relatively early in its history, half dozen or so. Some of them involving people, some places, and some of them involving new kinds of ships. So a thing is able to develop. A thing is able to develop by forming attachments with other things. But I don't think that a thing can ever be reduced to its actions in the way that actor network theory.
Yeah. You're talking about the theory of Bruno Latour.
Exactly.
And Latour says everything, you could define everything by its relations to other things. And not really about the things itself. And you want to talk about the things itself. And then you say style is really important. And this has also to do with the aesthetics. You think that, because the title is also a theory of everything, and a new theory of everything. And of course, then we think about physics. The string theory could deliver this new theory of everything. But you say, no, aesthetics can deliver this. And this has to do with the style. Maybe you can explain this, why aesthetics is so important for us.
Sure. I would say the public is always very hungry for theory of everything physics books.
Yeah.
If there's going to be something that explains what everything is made of that we see, and that's wonderful. I read such books at a high rate myself. I try to keep up somewhat with the current state of physics in as much as I can. And yet, by definition, nothing in physics can be a theory of everything because not everything is physical. Even if you're going to insist that nothing is supernatural or nothing is spiritual and that the physical lies at the basis of everything, even if we imagined a world with no God or angels or spirits or ghosts, it would still not be the case that physics can explain everything. Even if everything is ultimately made of the physical, certain things are emergent realities that go beyond the physical. So, for instance, the city of Los Angeles here, you could say it's physical in the sense that if all atoms were to disappear, Los Angeles would also disappear. And yet you can't really say that Los Angeles is merely a sum of atoms. People move in, move out every day. People die and people are born every day. There are small changes in the city's culture every day. And yet something about Los Angeles that we can't quite put our finger on remains the same. Now, there may be privileged moments of crisis where it's not quite clear what constitutes Los Angeles and what does not. So there was a movement a while ago, for instance, to have the San Fernando Valley break off from the city of Los Angeles and form another. And that would have turned Los Angeles and San Fernando into the second and third largest cities in the United States. And Chicago would have, Chicago would have been reduced to the fifth or something. But there has to be plenty of room in the world for things that are not physical, even if there are physical constituents that ultimately make it up.
So the physical thing is not all there is. There's more than the physical thing, and that's why the physics can't deliver this theory. But how can the aesthetics deliver this theory of everything? Could you explain this really short?
I can. Object-Oriented Ontology considers aesthetics central to everything we do because it reinterprets aesthetics as a split between an object and its own qualities. So for instance, in metaphor, you're comparing two objects. The metaphor is something I've written quite a lot about. If you're comparing two objects, what I argue in my book is that you're stripping the qualities away from one object and assigning it to another. And since in a good metaphor, the connection between the object and its new qualities is never very literally convincing, human performance of this metaphor mentally is very important. What's the largest difference between a metaphorical statement and a literal statement? Well, there are a couple of things, but one of them you have to notice is that literal statements are reversible and metaphorical statements are not. So if I say that a pen is like a pencil or a pencil is like a pen, makes no difference.
So this literal statement, that's a little bit what people like Dennett want to do, no? They want to have these literal statements about reality and they think this is the best thing we can do.
Dennett is a literalist to the core, yes.
Yeah.
As much as I enjoy reading his books, which are very clear, I never agree with him on anything. The idea that all you have to do is state literal truths about reality and then you'll get rid of all fuzziness and all muddle-headed thinkers, I think somewhat misses the point, which is that reality itself is never clear. No. Reality itself is somewhat mysterious. And this is what philosophy is about from the beginning. It's philosophia. It's a love of wisdom. It's not an actual wisdom. It's not a capture of the literal truth of anything. Yeah. And this is what has distinguished philosophia from any form of knowledge since the beginning. And certainly in the case of Plato, also in the case of Aristotle, who points out the paradox that we can't define a thing because things are concrete and definitions are made of universals.
Yeah, so that's a very important thing. Things are specific and we have to use words and definitions which are general. So we can never, with the general words, we can never define the specific things which are here in the world.
It's a lot like trying to make a two-dimensional map out of a three-dimensional planet, which we know is mathematically impossible. You cannot make a street map of Amsterdam that will be geometrically accurate, no matter how hard you try, because Amsterdam is on a three-dimensional surface.
Yeah, there's this very interesting story from Borges, the writer. You know, he says somebody wants to make the perfect map, and then it ends up to make a map which is as big as the original place.
Exactly. If you want to avoid that, you're going to need to make translations. You're going to need to make a bridge between two incommensurable things. And so even something like pi in mathematics it's an irrational number. You can't ever get to the end when you're writing out pi 3.1415926. You'll never reach the end of that. And so any attempt to express pi in decimal notation is going to come up short.
Yeah.
And one thing that we like about aesthetics in Triple O is that people generally know that they cannot paraphrase an artwork or a literary work. This has been known in literary criticism and art criticism for quite some time, that the better your work of critique is as an art or literary critic, the more aesthetic your critique is going to become. You're going to have to use more metaphors. You're going to have to set the mood properly in your critique of Shakespeare or whatever other author you're writing about. And so Triple O is really a philosophy of incommensurabilities and tensions. This idea that a thing can never be replaced by an accurate description of it. Whereas someone like Dennett thinks that's what knowledge is, right? Knowledge is about giving accurate descriptions or paraphrases of things in literal language. This is impossible for a number of reasons. I mentioned mathematical and cartographical examples of maps and of pi and things like that. Try to summarize any metaphor in prose terms. You can't do that. And I mentioned the irreversibility of metaphors, and the reason they're irreversible, like when Homer says wine dark sea, famous metaphor from the Odyssey, you can also say the sea dark wine, but that's a different metaphor. And the reason it's a different metaphor is because in metaphorical language, one term plays the object role and the other provides the qualities. And you can reverse that, but then it's not the same metaphorical object that's created. So this also points to a tension in the heart of objects themselves. An object is both a unified thing, it also has a plurality of qualities, and there is no way to get at a thing by simply listing all of the qualities that it actually has. That's what I would call the literal description of a thing. The thing is more than that. The thing is something that unifies all those qualities and that changes those qualities. As Merleau-Ponty says, the black of an ink pen and the black of an executioner's hood are different blacks, even if they are the exact same wavelength of light. Yeah. The qualities are affected by the object to which they belong. So for all these reasons, a literal relation to the world is not possible.
So, and how does the aesthetic give a better description? How does it work? Maybe you can describe this, because it has to do with some important things distinctions you make within the objects. You know, you have the real object and you have the sensual object. You have the qualities of the object, and then you also have the real qualities and the sensual objects, sensory qualities. Maybe you can
sure.
Tell a little bit about this, and then in combination with your idea about aesthetics.
Okay. Throughout the history of philosophy, and this includes Eastern philosophy, you find a lot of fourfold structures. Why do these fourfolds keep recurring? Well, the easiest way to get a fourfold is to have two dualisms that cross each other. And the fourfold structure to which object-oriented ontology was led was based on, first of all, the distinction between a thing and how it appears. Yeah. Very classic distinction. You find it in Heidegger, you find it in Kant, you find it much earlier. However, modern philosophy has tended to see that as a distinction taking place in the human mind, as if we poor humans had this special burden of being unable to reach reality in itself, as if physical causation, physical collisions were somehow able to directly cause the interaction of two things, when that isn't the case. An inanimate interaction is also going to come up short of the things themselves. So if I look at cotton, I am oversimplifying the reality of that cotton. The same holds for animals, but the same holds for the fire that burns that cotton. Because no causal relationship is ever going to exhaust the terms of the relation. A fire does not need to interact with all aspects of the cotton in order to burn it. So it's an oversimplified relation, just like the human relation to cotton is. And yet, modern philosophy is so committed to seeing human relations to the world as something so utterly different in kind from anything else that it deserves a totally separate branch of philosophy. It's called epistemology sometimes. This idea that we first have to talk about the human relation to the world, thought's relation to the world, before we can say anything else about anything. The problem with that is we don't really have direct access to our own thoughts any more than we have direct access to the world. Introspection fails. Psychoanalysis exists because we don't have direct access to our own thoughts and emotions. And so we need to stop with the idea that we are somehow enclosed first in a sphere where the thought-world relation must be clarified, and then we go on to discuss other things. Though in fact, philosophy doesn't do that. Philosophy leaves all the other things to the natural sciences, assuming that they're dealing with inanimate things perfectly adequately. Whereas I'm saying that inanimate things are not being dealt with adequately, or certainly not exhaustively, by the sciences as we know them. And philosophy needs a little more courage in going back to a tradition of philosophizing about non-human things.
But if you look to, for example, you talked about this metaphor. What's happening when we have this metaphor about the dark, the wine dark sea? Sorry. So what's happening when we? I mean, if it's a very nice metaphor, you see it immediately. This sea which is dark and the structure of the sea. But what's happening when such a metaphor is we read it or we hear it?
The first thing to note is that the wine dark sea uses the common darkness of the wine and sea to link them, but that's not really what the metaphor is about. If Homer had simply said, have you ever noticed that the Mediterranean Sea is pretty much the same color as wine? We have at best a triviality and perhaps a falsehood, if you look at the exact wavelengths of light. Yet by calling the sea wine dark, Homer is inviting us to imagine other resemblances between the wine and the sea that are not stated in the metaphor. So depth, intoxication, danger, and oblivion, things of this sort that we associate with wine are now ascribed to the sea. And if someone tells me that the sea is blue or green, the sea is green, this can give me an interesting, vivid mental picture, but it's still an attempt at a literal statement. And so I don't become personally involved in that statement the way I do with wine dark sea. When someone says wine dark sea and I have to imagine this sea with wine qualities, which is something that none of us have literally experienced, it takes a certain effort. It takes a certain effort to perform a metaphor in our heads in a way that literal language does not. And it doesn't always succeed. Some metaphors go nowhere with many of us.
You call this acting, no? It's a kind of acting. We have to act. We have to take the position of the sea, something like this.
That's right. From Russia, we have Stanislavski's acting system, which in Hollywood is known as the method.
Method acting.
And the method actor is the one who tries to live the character they're playing throughout the shooting of the
Marlon
film.
Brando, who's really the Godfather. No, he was already the Godfather because before he was there on the set, he was already acting like this because he wanted to be like the Godfather.
Yes, and people forget his career was at a low point at that moment, but he showed up for the audition in character as Don Vito Corleone. And that's an example of what method actors can do well. And to perform a metaphor is to have to become something like a method actor. You are the one producing that wine dark sea in your mind for the first time. And this is ultimately what makes aesthetic experience more gripping than most literal experience. The fact that your personal capacity to believe in something is involved. Your life consists in that moment in trying to produce this wine dark sea in your minds. Whereas if someone just mentions a word or states a proposition, you can maintain a certain distance from that proposition as you judge it carefully. But if you are personally called upon to generate an aesthetic object, as you are in some sense bound over to that object. You are part of the object. And this is why aesthetics becomes so important in a triple O context. It also means that belief is important again. Throughout the modern period, we saw belief as a negative thing. We saw it as a naive thing, as something that we had to distance ourselves from, to something we had to subtract from any statements in order to make the statement more compelling. I think now we're starting to see the opposite again, that an element of belief is present in all truth. And I'm certainly not the first to have discussed that. Michael Polanyi's books are one good source on the philosophy of belief. If you go back to the 19th century, Cardinal Newman, the British Catholic, wrote a wonderful book on what he calls the grammar of assent. There are many things, most of the things we believe are not believed due to adequate scientific evidence. And for most of us, we're simply deferring to adequate scientific authorities in the case of scientific knowledge. If I hear someone denying climate change, I will probably chuckle at them or be annoyed with them, but am I personally capable of presenting the case for climate change? Not so much. I've read enough that I can do it in a rough fashion, but I'm not a climate scientist, and I cannot directly present test results to climate change deniers. So to a certain extent, we are all indebted to epistemic authorities, people in each area who can tell us what the best evidence tells us is the case.
Yeah.
Nonetheless, there are also things all of us believe with no adequate scientific evidence, simply through experience or perhaps through prejudice. And those are also not simply to be negated or erased. These form an important part of our ecology of beliefs, that I believe a number of things simply on hunch. This is true of scientists as well, for instance. When Newton was developing his theory of gravity, famously, unlike Einstein, Newton assumed that gravity happens at infinite speeds before Einstein showed that it would have to be limited to the speed of light. And yet we have in Newton's correspondence the admission that he doesn't really quite believe that gravity works at infinite speed. This would amount to action at a distance. And so he's not comfortable with it, but it's something he uses for the purposes of his theory. And yet he has this other hunch, this kind of so far unproven belief that gravity must not be working at infinite speed, that must not be working at infinite speed. He simply cannot account for that in his theory. And so we need to become more open in our ideas about what counts as a worthy belief, right? It's not all just about been proven to our epistemic satisfaction, but that there's as I mentioned, a whole ecology of beliefs, which includes things that we haven't proven, that we probably can never prove. And science would actually die without this, because scientists would not be able to follow their instincts about what's wrong with contemporary theories of in science and try to improve them. And so it's often said that knowledge is justified true belief in professional philosophy.
Yeah.
I think the problem is justification, truth, and belief are three very different kinds of things that don't go well together. And so for me, for instance, justification, which is what we find in science, science can't be about truth because science is fallible. If Newton had said in his time that the infinite speed of gravity is the truth, he would have been refuted 2 centuries later. And so he kept a certain distance from that. And I think ultimately what justification is about telling us what things we are allowed to say in public with a certain degree of confidence. And around that, like a halo, we have any number of intuitions and half-developed thoughts that are real for us and that structure our intellectual lives, but are things we may not yet feel comfortable about saying in public. So I would say, paradoxically, that science is about justified false belief, not about justified true belief.
Yeah.
Whereas most of our lives concerns unjustified true belief, truths that we live by, but that we are not able to prove to others always in an organized debate.
Yeah.
So
aesthetics is also unjustified truth belief?
Exactly.
And so your book is also unjustified truth belief?
Certain aspects of it are, but there's also justifications in there because I also give arguments. And we have a whole branch of contemporary philosophy, analytic philosophy, which thinks everything in philosophy is about arguments, but it isn't. Yeah. Because first of all, there are some things we never think to argue about, some things we never question. Some of those involve daily practices. Some of those involve background conditions of experience that Kant questioned, such as space and time and the categories of the understanding. But not everything we believe is something that we can defend rationally using systematic justifications.
Yeah.
And so it's wrong for that reason to think that you can have a system of philosophy or a system of science, because there will always be these holes that appear as soon as you try to specify any of your theories with sufficient detail. So this is why another reason aesthetics is important for us in object-oriented ontology, as you mentioned, because you cannot have an aesthetic theory without, in some sense, believing in the aesthetic object. If you are unable to get to that point, then you're probably in the phase of mocking an artwork that you think is of shoddy quality or poor quality. You're sitting there in the theater laughing at every scene. That's not really an aesthetic experience. That can be a good critical experience. But since aesthetics asks you to produce those objects in your own minds, there is no escaping the fact that aesthetics involves a form of belief.
Okay, thank you. So we have a little bit an idea of your philosophy. There are these objects. Everything can be an object, and but it's impossible to grasp the object because the object is always withdrawing. And maybe with the aesthetics we can get an idea of a certain object in a way, but then we are involved. No? So it's not an objective truth about a certain object. So that's,
maybe I should say something about the withdrawing, since I don't think we've discussed.
Maybe you could.
Yeah, the withdrawal of real objects is a key concept in object-oriented ontology, and the main source of that for me was Heidegger, his idea that the truth is always veiled, the thing is unveiled only gradually. And of course, you can find it in Kant, and you can find it in earlier philosophers if you know where to look for it. And so withdrawal is simply the Heideggerian term that we borrowed, in the sense that the thing is never going to be directly manifest to us. The thing is always going to be communicated to us in terms of signs or in terms of hints, innuendo. And again, many people don't like this because they think it turns philosophy into this subjective free-for-all where anybody can say anything they want. But what I would say in return is that think about how ridiculous it would be to demand that Leonardo had painted the Mona Lisa in direct sunlight, which is essentially what I imagine Daniel Dennett is doing, right? Why did you have to create this chiaroscuro? Why this shadow? It makes it so much harder to see her. Well, the point is that reality itself is also filled with shadows. It's not only filled with sunlight. And you need to know when to use one and when to use the other. And this goes as far back as Heraclitus in pre-Socratic philosophy, where he talks about nature gives a sign, or that the oracle at Delphi gives a sign. What he seems to be trying to say there is that nothing is given to us directly. That philosophia means that the thing is luring us. The thing is tempting us to get closer. And the only way to get even closer to that thing is through indirect means.
Yeah. So that's
not through liberalism.
No. Right. So we can't go direct to the objects. We always need a way through aesthetics, maybe through science, but then science can never reveal everything. That's the problem you mentioned in your book. But let's get back to where we started, but maybe a little bit more about this. So if all the objects have the same status, if the human object is not really special, what does it mean for us? How do we have to live? I mean, there are many other objects here. How do we try to get them in account? We have to live with them? How do we have to change our life because of this
theory?
Very
interesting. You're leading us into the political dimension of the question. And what interests me about this is that if you go back and look at modern political theory in both its left and right versions, what the left and the right have in common, and we have to remember that that's a relatively recent distinction since the French Revolution, that everyone is measured politically in terms of left and right. What you really have there are two different theories of human nature. That for the left, the human is a naturally benevolent creature who has been corrupted by the faults of society. For the right-winger, humans are a naturally dangerous animal who must be controlled with force. And what those two theories have in common is the idea.
Say the one is Rousseau, no?
Yes,
Jean-Jacques
Rousseau and Marx.
Is the thinking people are good and society is bad, and then the other is maybe Hobbes or something, Thomas Hobbes.
Hobbes and Schmitt and Machiavelli.
Saying society is good, people are bad.
Yes, that's in simplest form, that's what modern political theory tells us. And it's simply an argument over which of those is true. And as usual with these kinds of trench warfare, neither of those is going to be true because they share a faulty central assumption, which is that human nature is the central topic of political philosophy. And yet this isn't the case. If we look at how the political sphere is kept stable and even how it changes, a lot of it has to do with inanimate objects. So when coinage is introduced or when smartphones and social media appear, these have tremendous impact upon politics. We saw this in the United States beginning in 2016. It's really distorted our political space here in a way that has never been rectified. So I think we need to look politically at the role of inanimate actors, including, or not only inanimate actors, also animals. Animals have to become a political topic. And so what are we going to look at in the political theory of the future? Not just human nature, but probably the way that humans interact with objects to try to create some sort of stable space for life and for action. So these days, carbon dioxide is a major political actor. No one would have thought this possible in the time of Hobbes or Rousseau. Imagine telling them that carbon dioxide, which probably wasn't even known by then, is actually going to be one of the major political topics of the 21st century. It would have meant nothing to them. It would have been unintelligible. And yet it is. And so I think what frustrates me sometimes is that people on the contemporary left are sticking with a left that was relevant for the age of philosophical idealism and factory capitalism. And that's not what we're in anymore. I mean, there may be some ideas worth saving from that, but ultimately we have to reconceive politics as involving both humans and non-humans.
Yeah, that's the thing. And so could you give another example of what would change in politics? For example, now we have these new elections. Would they be different if we take into account the fact that objects are also very important for politics?
Yes, and for me, what humans should be dealing with is not truth, which none of us can get, but reality. We have to be able to recognize reality telling us things when it happens, and the message is always going to be ambiguous. Right now, the climate is telling us certain things, and we have to learn to respond to that instead of bringing everything back into a philosophizing about human thoughts and the structures of human thoughts and human nature, we need to look at how we are interacting with things. What role do trees play in our politics now, or should they? What role, this doesn't just happen in politics. There was a kind of revolution in geology when it was discovered that lots of material is coming to Earth from outer space, and that this may somehow have affected certain things about the Earth's climate over time. So we are trying to open up beyond the closed sphere of the human and the human planet to consider systems where things from the outside are also affecting us. And in the case of politics, that means largely inanimate objects. And in the case of the present political moment in the United States, which is also unfortunately a world political moment, since I think Trump is a threat to everyone who cares about democracy, Trump, I think, is less of a post-truth figure than a post-reality figure. Because I don't think there ever was a truth figure, except in the sense that we all defer to the scientific authorities on this or that issue. What Trump does, and this is Bruno Latour's idea, not mine, is that Trump is less a fascist than an escapist. That if in Latour's eyes, the major political issues of the present are the climate and immigration, both of them closely linked, Trump is someone who exists on the basis of denying both of those problems. He wants to simply deport 1.5 million residents from the United States and pretend that climate change is not something anthropogenic, not human-made. And so he's someone who allows us to try to forget reality and pretend we're living in the 1950s or perhaps something worse. And so instead of claiming that we need to have a politics grounded in truth, I would want a politics grounded in reality. And that reality involves the fact that there's going to be less arable farmland, there are going to be higher sea levels, our population is too high, and so forth. And we don't know how to respond to each of these things, nor do we understand the exact nature of each of these factors. But we need to open up to taking these seriously as political facts. And again, I think the contemporary left is often too focused on a modern issue, which is that who is the cogito? Is the cogito just a white male? We need more diversity in representing the cogito. Yes, we do, in practical terms. We do need to diversify the people who are allowed to take the place of the cogito, except it's even better to just get rid of the cogito. Get rid of the idea that the human thinker is some special thing outside of the rest of reality that is able to command it. We are actually vulnerable to the world outside us as well. And again, that's not a completely new idea, but I don't think a system of political theory has been completely built around human weakness and human dependence in the way that the present moment requires.
Yeah. Okay. Let's move to the last question, and then it's time for you. If you have any questions, you can. There's a mic. Someone will come around with the mic. But one more question before this, we go over to you. If these people later that we go home, yeah, and often it's this with a new philosophical theory. If you really understand it a little bit, the world is a little bit different. It's what Oscar Wilde says. He says, reality is following art. Art is not following reality, something like this. So if we have a new theory, we see the world in a new way. So what is this new way these people will see the world after they listen to you? What do you think their worldview how will it be changed by your vision,
What I would like them to see differently is that I think at present there's a tendency to think of the world as somehow a set of boring slabs of inanimate matter, and that somehow you need to bring the human factor into reality to liven it up. Now, humans are interesting. I don't think we're central, but of course we're very interesting to ourselves, and we're very interesting by comparison with some objects that have fewer capacities than we do. But I think what I would like people to see after reading my work is that there is a tension in reality itself, even when humans aren't there. A thing both has and does not have its qualities. A thing is changing qualities and yet paradoxically remaining the same. These are old metaphysical points, and yet if you can see reality itself as being as much an affection of a poem, I think this is something people can get from my philosophy. Okay. And also go ahead.
No, say. Yeah.
The idea that we are building hybrids of human and non-human things. And this is something you also find in Latour. You find this in the endosymbiosis theory in biology of Lynn Margulis, that evolution occurs through the merger of previously separate life forms. I think the idea of reality is made of hybrids where things are not quite themselves and where things are making strange unions with other things. This is, I think, one of the most interesting results of object-oriented ontology.
Okay, thank you. We will go to the people over there, and if somebody has a question, please raise your hand, and then we will come to you with the mic. Yeah, I see a question over there, and over there, yeah. Wait.
Test.
Yeah, type. Maybe you can. Oh no, over there, on the right. Yeah, over there. It's not so easy. Objects are
well, first of all, thank you very much for your explanations and you being here today. I thought it was very interesting. One thing which I wondered, as to your point about getting in our political discourse, getting back to a discourse grounded in more in reality instead of debating truths. You said we should get back to basic facts, such as the fact that we have less arable farmland, we have rising sea levels. But my instinct would be that the response of in many a political discussion, if you say, well, we have to deal with the fact that the sea levels are rising, a response from many people, especially on the far right, would be, no, they aren't. And then we are back to a discussion of truth. So how would your sort of reframing of truth versus reality avoid this sort of feedback loop where side A says something is a problem and the response from side B is simply saying, no, it isn't?
Thank you.
Yes, and in a way, the problem of democracy is how do you make those decisions and then how do you enforce them? And going back to Latour for a second here, he had a kind of disturbing resource to Carl Schmitt at times in saying points where you declare the other as the enemy. That Latour had reached the point where he said that climate change deniers were simply not to be reasoned with anymore. We simply had to act. And so I think this is the kind of moment we're at in history, is where anybody can deny anything, and yet we do have to have a certain reliance on epistemic authority, which is hard for us to do because modern philosophy was all about critique. It was about challenging everything that authority tells you. And now we're finding that that has its own drawbacks. It means that a person we would consider ignorant about the climate is trying to simply deny the things that we are taught to believe about it by science. The class I'm teaching this semester is on conspiracy theories. And so this topic is very much on my mind, that ultimately what allows us to defeat conspiracy theories is our reliance upon a network of people we have given the authority to decide about certain matters. So if 97% of client scientists believe something, we have to leave room for dissent, of course, but political decision doesn't always have time to allow that dissent to occur indefinitely. So we can't let the climate change debate go on for 300 more years, obviously. We're reaching a point where certain steps have to be taken, and we are simply going to have to exclude those from the discussion who believe in things like lizard people or other theories of that sort. I also had an interesting time in this class on conspiracy theories looking at poll information, poll data, about what percentage of the population believes in each kind of conspiracy, right? Each kind of conspiracy theory. And what I found is that the mainstream conspiracy theories usually are in the upper 40s or low 50s. So the most popular conspiracy theory in the United States is the Kennedy assassination. And usually, a little over 50% of Americans do not believe the official story. So that's a problem. And then you have other conspiracy theories in the 40-some% range, like the belief that a small group of powerful people secretly controls the world, or that the government is covering up evidence of UFOs. I don't believe that anymore because the government's no longer covering it up. The United States Navy is releasing video and admitting that we've encountered these UFOs off the Pacific coast of the United States. And then you get down to another slightly lower zone of conspiracy theories that can be purely partisan in the 30s. So, for example, the idea that Barack Obama was not born in the United States. That's something like 31% of Americans. It's almost all Republicans. And then you get down to the really crazy stuff under 10%, people wearing tinfoil hats, or that the world is controlled by lizard people, or that the QAnon theory, that Democrats are secretly sexually abusing children, and Donald Trump and John F. Kennedy Jr., who isn't really dead, are crusading to save these children. When you get down below that, you get down to people who are simply not taken seriously by society, by most of society, and they are not allowed to let their views influence policy. And interestingly, belief in global warming is getting to that point. In the United States, we had 18% climate change skeptics. It's now down to 13%, the last I saw. So once it gets down to 6 or 7%, I think that problem will largely be gone. There will still be a few fringe conspiracy theorists saying, no, the sea level isn't rising. But it will have gotten to enough of a level of belief that we can safely ignore those people in our political deliberations, just like we ignore those who believe in lizard people controlling the world, or who believe in Jesuit conspiracies to this day. So unfortunately, my answer is that eventually political authority and political force are used to decide some of those things, right? That the government will act. It can't wait for every last holdout to be convinced that climate change is happening.
Thank you. Is there somebody else who has a question? There's time, I think, for one more question. No? Otherwise, yes, there is one question. That's our last question.
Okay.
I guess I was wondering how your life has changed if you apply your philosophy, and also maybe how human relationships. Maybe this is a bad question. Sorry. If like how human relationships are affected by your philosophy as well, because and you kind of went over this. A lot of people understand themselves better through other people.
Yes, that goes into the triple O critique of modern philosophy, the idea that we somehow have more transparent or more direct access to ourselves than to anything else. And there are all kinds of reasons not to believe that. Psychoanalysis has taught us about how self-understanding is mediated through language, through others. We all learn who we are through social interactions, not through sitting around in brooding introspection alone in our bedroom or something. And so these are other reasons not to place the self-transparency of human thought at the center of philosophy. And the other question was, how has my life changed? It's hard to say because I've been doing this since I was 16. And so it's hard for me to imagine a time when I was outside of philosophy, not affected by it. But certainly it does affect you on even a daily basis. That if you think through philosophical problems seriously for over a course of many years, it is going to change how you see the world and how you see other people.
So it is. Thank you very much for this interesting answers. Thank you very much for your conversation. Thank you very much, everybody. And maybe we will look to the world in a different way now. Thank you.
Thank you.